Welcome to Economy Disrupted. I'm Stephanie Siegel, Senior Fellow with the Economics Program at CSIS. And this week, we're going to discuss the relationship between domestic economic developments and U.S. engagement and leadership in the world. As you watch, you can submit your questions online at csis.org, Economy Disrupted.
And I'm Matthew Goodman. We'll have about 45 minutes with our guest, who I'll introduce in a second. And then we're going to end with our usual segment, The Bottom Line. So please stick around until 3:50 Eastern Time if you can. But with that, I'm delighted to introduce our guest today, Wally Adeyemo. Wally is most importantly a non-resident senior advisor to the CSIS Economics Program. And he is also former Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics in the Obama administration, had a number of other roles in the administration. He's also currently president of the Obama Foundation, but just to stress, he's here in his personal capacity, not on behalf of the foundation. So welcome to Economy Disrupted, Wally.
Matt and Stephanie, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here with you and good to see you. And it's looking forward to the conversation.
Delighted to have you. So let's get right into it. So in your Obama administration capacity, you had a number of roles in both domestic and international policy, and we want to touch on both in this program. But let me start with the international. Your last job was as the senior international economic policy guy at the White House, advising President Obama on those topics. And that included being the G20 Sherpa, meaning the guy who helps the president prepare for the annual summits of economic leaders. So that was an important role, particularly following the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, when that body was advanced to leaders level. Today, we're in a global pandemic that has caused the worst economic dislocation to the global economy since the Great Depression. And it feels like this is the kind of situation that is just tailor-made for a body like the G20, a group of countries representing 85% of the world economy, to come together and to try to find common cause to address these kind of dual crises of the pandemic and the economic shock. And yet most people would say that the G20 today has not really stepped up, that its response has been kind of tepid, to put it mildly. So my questions to you, three-part, are, do you agree with that? The G20 hasn't been as robust as it could be. Secondly, why is that? Why hasn't it been able to step up in the way it did back when you were doing this or in the global financial crisis? And third, what can be done about it?
So Matt, in general, I do agree with your synopsis that the G20 could be doing more, but they have done some things that have been meaningful. One, they acted quickly. Two, the fiscal stimulus that they've actually introduced into the world is greater than the amount of fiscal stimulus they introduced during the global financial crisis. The reality, though, is that this crisis is far more significant in terms of the impact on the real economy. And the third thing that they've done that's been meaningful is debt extension for poor countries, which is meaningful to allowing those countries to continue to deal with the real human costs that they're dealing with in their countries. The reality is that the failure of the G20 so far comes down to their inability to follow what was a pretty simple framework that was created during the global financial crisis. The G20 then was focused on two things. One, stopping the crisis, and then two, ensuring that it would never happen again. So they stopped the crisis through use of tools like fiscal stimulus, but also through global coordination, through the financial FSB and through bodies like that, and also by strengthening international cooperation. In this case, for example, the G20 hasn't stepped up to strengthen organizations like the WHO, which is an organization that was tailor-made to deal with something like a global pandemic. Instead of stepping away from the WHO, what the G20 should be doing is working to strengthen and empower the WHO to help to serve as a coordinating function for global efforts to defeat the pandemic. In addition to that, during our time in office, we focused heavily on the global health security agenda, which was an agenda built towards building the infrastructure within countries to ensure that they would be prepared to deal with pandemics. There was an active debate when I was at the White House and when I was at the Treasury Department about whether the G20 should be exclusively focused on economic issues, but in addition to, or be focused on economic issues and a range of other issues that would ultimately impact the economy. Fundamentally, one of those issues that we pushed strenuously in the Obama administration was global pandemics. We knew that if we didn't get that right, it would have dire economic consequences, which we're seeing today. So in order for the G20 to get this right, they really do need to do the two things that they did early on, which is stop the crisis, and then secondly, ensure the crisis never happens again. And they stopped the crisis by ensuring that they're working together to develop things like a vaccine, and that the vaccine fund is not something that is only accessible to certain countries, but that we're planning for a vaccine that will be helpful to everyone. Two, that they're sharing information and data about how the virus is mutating and what can be done to contain it globally. And three, that they're actually providing resources to the international financial institutions. At the moment, the IMF has announced that they have $1 trillion of resources available for countries in need. And while that sounds like a great deal of money, when you compare it to what we've already done in the United States, which is nearly $3 trillion of resources just for the United States, you realize that given the size of the hole created by the coronavirus, the IMF is likely going to need additional resources. So the United States and other countries are going to need to be prepared to provide support for the IMF and the other international financial institutions to help cushion the blow that's created by the economic fallout from the coronavirus.
Right. Well, you're absolutely right to link the pandemic and the economic crisis and the fact that G20 can't just focus on the economics. They have to focus on the underlying health problem in some way. They have to come together. And then, as you say, there are a number of things that need to be done. And by the way, shameless advertising, Stephanie and our program are tracking quite closely the G20, both the fiscal response and the international financial institution response. So we've got a couple of trackers on that on our web platform. Thanks for giving me that opportunity. Let me ask a follow-up question, though, which is about how much this is the problem today is about the U.S. China relationship, which is obviously in a very difficult situation, a lot of tension on a lot of issues, seems to be getting worse every day. A lot of people are actually critical of the Obama administration for not having woken up early enough to the China risk and not having responded forcefully enough. Do you think that's a fair critique? And if you were back in charge, what would you do about the China challenge?
I think that's an unfair critique. You have to go to the beginning of when the Obama administration started, and we started dealing with the global financial crisis when we came into office. And we actually worked quite well with China to address the financial crisis at that point, at a moment where the crisis had emanated from the United States. The Chinese government and governments around the world saw that working closely with the United States to address this issue wasn't just to the benefit of the United States economy, it was to the benefit of the global economy. And in lots of ways, the pandemic that the epicenter was clearly in China is an example of a place where the United States and China working together have a mutual interest in addressing this global issue. But unlike the global financial crisis, the two countries have not found a way to work together, not only to the fault of the United States. It's clear that China could have done more to declare information about what was going on in the country and shared information more quickly. But fundamentally, in order for the G20 to work well, in my experience, it works best when the United States and China are leading together. And while some have thought that the only way to address China is to be tough on China, it's also important to realize that in some places we have shared interests with China. And during the Obama administration, we focused on many of those shared interests. For example, the Iran deal and the climate deal. And while we focused on the places where we had shared interests, we also, where China was acting in a way that was outside the realm of norms and rules that had been set globally, we raised the cost for that action by China, either by using our trade tools or by using maritime defense to demonstrate to China that we were not going to allow them to violate the rules and norms that have existed for a long time, both in the Asia Pacific, but also globally. I would say that today, when you look at where China is and where the United States is, because we've allowed our alliances to fray, and because we have looked inward, China actually has more freedom now to define what's happening in the Asia Pacific than they've had probably since the end of World War II. Fundamentally, our strategy in the Obama administration was to use our alliances as a means to demonstrate to China that they were isolated in the area of maritime security, isolated in the area of trade. Building alliances and building partnerships take time, but ultimately they're the most effective way to get countries like China to behave in a manner that's consistent with international rules and norms. And you can't do that without also working with China in areas where we have shared interests. For example, if we do not get the pandemic under control in China and the United States, there's no way the global economy will ever recover. So we have a shared interest in ensuring that the coronavirus is something that's contained globally.
Right, well said. Okay, Stephanie?
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot in what you've just said that I want to return to, including U.S. China. I want to shift a bit more now to the domestic side of the equation. Before I do that, though, just given your conversation with Matt on G20 and the importance of cooperation, the reality is there is deep skepticism in the United States among its citizens as to how these international organizations benefit the average American. And that seems to me a big problem as far as mobilizing support for working through these multilateral channels. Do you have any thoughts as to why there is such a deep skepticism and what is the answer to that? And I think that might be a lead-in to talk about some of the domestic issues.
I think the reason that there's such a deep skepticism about the international institutions and also what some would call the global order is because we've been unable to demonstrate that the rules that were put in place to help lead to prosperity and security since the end of World War II is actually leading to shared prosperity for people in our country and around the world. The same thing that drove people to the British citizens to give up on the EU are driving people in the United States to question the same institutions that have helped provide the security and prosperity. And until we're in a place where we are finding ways to advance policies that actually lead to greater equality in terms of not outcomes, but opportunities in our countries, people are going to continuously question why the institutions that were created at Bretton Woods matter to them and actually improve their lives. So I don't think that their disillusionment is without reason. It is because we have failed in many ways as policymakers to focus on inequality in meaningful ways, both domestically, but globally as well.
Yeah, so that you are getting at this notion of prosperity, shared prosperity. And I want to switch to the domestic agenda. You were, I think Matt might have mentioned in the introduction, among the positions you held were Deputy Director to the National Economic Council. I just read a description of that body, the NEC, as the war room for government-wide economic policy. So that's the entity that can really view across the government the different agencies that have the tools to address specific economic issues. So two-part question. One, when you were in that position, I think it was 2016 into 2017, what were the priorities at that time as far as what the NEC saw the government should be doing to address what priority issues in the NEC's mind? And then if you were in that position now, given what Matt and you have been discussing with COVID-19, what should be the priorities?
At that point in 2016, we were nearing the end of the Obama administration, and part of our goal was really to secure many of the changes that had already occurred in government policy. Much of my time was spent trying to make sure that we fully implemented the Dodd-Frank Act, which celebrated its 10th birthday just a few weeks ago, ensuring that we had a financial system in which consumers felt protected, and we had a financial system that was also in a place where it could withstand risks. One of the risks we're obviously seeing now with the pandemic. But in addition to thinking about the financial system, we spent a great deal of time thinking about housing. And my time was spent thinking about housing policy and what do we do to make sure that we're creating a set of housing reforms that create opportunities for Americans to be mobile and to move to places where they can find work, opportunities to purchase homes, opportunities to find housing that are not just affordable, but also housing that promotes opportunity for them to put their children in good schools, to be in a place where they have the ability to think through what their careers look like over the long term. So a great deal of time was spent on trying to ensure that the reforms that we've been working on for 8 years were actually being implemented.
Can I ask if, Matt, will you let me just have one more question before I pass it back to you? Because Wally had mentioned earlier the issue of inequality. I a number of questions on the topic of inequality. That seems to be a recurring theme for us in this economy disrupted format. But a very basic question, which is one about why does inequality matter? And let me provide the background. Anyone that would Google inequality, you'll find a line of argumentation, which is basically that focus is misplaced. Instead, the focus should be on economic growth. And if the economy is growing, and if everybody benefits from that growth, let's not worry so much about those at the top doing well, as long as those at the bottom of the economic ladder are also doing well. The counter to that is no, we should be focused on what that gap is between the highest earning and the lowest earning. What's your view as to how inequality kind of feeds into what should be the priorities of any administration? And does inequality matter, or should the focus really be placed on creating an environment that allows for rapid economic growth and not micromanaging so much how that growth is distributed?
So, Stephanie, I'll answer that question, but I'll also answer the second part of your first question. I got so nostalgic about my time in the Obama administration that I didn't talk about what I would do now on inequality.
Yeah.
But to your question, the reality is that you cannot address inequality without going after the things that actually cause it. You have to address things like systemic racism in order to close the gaps that are related to inequality. There is the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats, but if boats start at different places in the harbor, they're not going to be lifted equally as high. So the way I think about this is that we have to address the inequality of opportunity within America if we're going to actually give people a chance to actually have an opportunity to be mobile within their economic lives. Some of the data out there is just damning when you look at it. For example, in 1940, a child born there had a 90% chance of earning more income than their parents. But today, less than 50% of children have that same opportunity. And when you compare that by race or by socioeconomic status, the data is even worse. And when you look at what's happened in the country over the last few months, often as people who work on economic policy, we focus on the data. And the data has borne out for a long time that people of color have suffered more and faced worse outcomes than people who are white in this country for a long time. But when you look at the images and the death of George Floyd and so many others over the last several months, it's allowed America to awaken to the fact that in lots of ways, those outcomes are even worse for Black people in this country than others. And in order to address that, we have to address systemic racism within the country. Raphael Bostic, who's the president of the Atlanta Fed, I think put it best when he said that systemic racism is a headwind to growth and also affects the ability of Americans to live out their economic potential. So I'd say that that is fundamentally one of the reasons that we have to go after inequality directly in order for us to actually have the type of economy we want in America. And it also goes back to your earlier question in terms of if we want to continue to live within a world order in which America is at the center, we have to be able to demonstrate to the American people that the system actually provides an opportunity for shared prosperity. If I was back in my old seat now and I was working for the NEC director, I'd be advancing really three criteria items three-part criteria when you think about economic policy at the moment. One is that we have to take steps that help us address inequality meaningfully. Two is we have to take steps to make sure that America is more competitive going forward. And three, we need to be focused more on the future than on the past. When I say focus more on the future than on the past, the reality is that the economy is going to change. The jobs that existed before the pandemic, many of them will come back, but some will not. Because in lots of ways, the pandemic has been an accelerant of change rather than a creator of change. And one of the ways we think about that is exactly what we're doing here. We're on a Zoom conversation that's being carried through YouTube. And the reality is people are going to work from home more in the future. You look at what's happened to e-commerce. E-commerce has increased dramatically during the pandemic. the likelihood is that that's going to be a continuing trend in this country. So as we think about economic policy going forward, how do we prepare Americans for those jobs of the future rather than simply trying to recreate the jobs of the past is something that I think we have to focus on. Specific policies that we need to think about are what can we do to strengthen our safety net? You look at the unemployment insurance debate that's happening now in Congress, it's about the dollar figure, but you also need to think about the pool of people who are covered by unemployment insurance. How do we make sure that unemployment insurance actually covers people who are working in what you would call the gig economy? People who are driving in Uber cars or doing other things that allow them to earn an income, but they may not have a W-2 in the way that many employees who are getting unemployment insurance do today. Or we also need to think about what we do to expand access to food and medical care for young children. While we've done a lot in terms of trying to make sure that we've expanded the safety net on healthcare and also tried to ensure that more children are covered, we still have a number of people who don't have access to quality healthcare. The other thing that I'd be focused on is infrastructure, and not just traditional infrastructure, but also digital infrastructure. The digital divide in America remains real, and it's something that impacts children in urban areas as well as in rural areas. As we head towards the fall, so many kids will be going to school online, and that's going to be a challenge for parents who are trying to attempt to balance their jobs and their work. But imagine the number of kids in America who live in poor urban areas or in rural areas who don't have access to high-speed internet. For them, they don't even have access to online schooling. So that's an issue that we have to address as a country. And then finally, I'd say traditional infrastructure. Our infrastructure is dilapidated and old. And ultimately, if we want to remain competitive, we want to remain the world's strongest economy, we need to invest in infrastructure. And by the way, those infrastructure jobs are well-paying jobs that create opportunities for Americans. So those are some of the issues that I'd be focused on if I was back in my old job.
Yeah, and I like your description. I've heard it before, and we've said it before, of COVID-19 as an accelerant, because everything you've listed there, I think those have been parts of the policy discussion for a while now, but this is really kind of this action forcing event where it's impossible to not see how critical a lot of those issues are.
Yeah, I mean, it's a terrific agenda, and gosh, I wish we had more time to talk about each one of those things. But just as a broad reaction, I would say, it shows also how much there is to do to get at these issues of opportunity, of equality of opportunity. As you were careful to say, not outcome, but of opportunity. We want the outcomes to be as shared as possible, but the issue is if you don't provide the opportunities, then you're not going to get to those outcomes. And there's a lot of things in the way, some of which are kind of traditional economic policy things, and some of which get to sort of deeper issues like systemic racism that is partly a function of those economic policies, but not entirely. So it's incredibly interlinked, all of this stuff, which leads me to a question to try to pull the domestic and international together. So a lot of that stuff that you just laid out is part of what Vice President Biden has laid out as a potential agenda for his administration if he's elected in November. And in conveying that over the last few weeks in a series of speeches, I've been struck by the fact that it's just such an ambitious domestic agenda that the international issues almost get drowned out. And, in fact, you even get a sense from maybe less from Vice President Biden himself, but from his campaign, that the focus is going to be on those domestic issues, and we're going to sort of postpone our work on international economics. That's probably unfair, but there's a little bit of that, certainly with respect to trade, and where it's a little more explicit that we're not going to be doing trade and so forth. Is that the right way to think about this? I mean, to me, it feels like we should be able to walk and chew gum. Difficult as those domestic challenges are, and as broad as they are, we also need to be engaged. You made a very, strong case for our being engaged in the G20 and IFES and so forth. Can't we do both, or how do we do both?
It's a great question, and I think I'll take you back to our time in government. And I think that when you look at the global financial crisis, I talked about the fact that they had a two-part framework. One, stop the crisis from happening, and then two, make sure it never happened again. And on financial reform, when you look at what we did on financial reform, we figured out what we wanted to accomplish domestically, and we had a sense as to what made sense in terms of what we would do in America, but we also ensured that whatever we did in America, we would ensure that it was also done globally. So we worked through the global institutions to make sure that if we solved the financial problem in the United States, 5, 7 years later, we wouldn't be dealing with a global crisis in another country that would come and impact us financially. And I think that's exactly, the approach that Vice President Biden is laying out, based on my read, is we need to address the challenges that we have at home. And then from a point of strength, go out to the world and say that you also need to address these issues as well. I think that there's going to be sequencing will matter. And some of these issues will be things that we can't solve alone. You look, for example, at international tax. If we need a stronger international tax regime, that's important to us in the United States. We can't do that alone because companies are global and they have the ability to move their profits to other global centers. And we need to work with with other countries in the G20 to address this issue. So meaningful reform on tax policy in the United States will require global coordination. And there's a host of issues just like that we cannot solve them without working closely with our allies and in some cases our adversaries to ensure that we move forward on policy. Without thinking about policy in that way, without thinking about how we'll work together with other countries to advance our domestic agenda, our economy will grow slower and our people will suffer more because fundamentally the United States is an economy that represents 20% of the world with 4 to 5% of the people. And if we're going to grow our economy into the future, it's going to require us to work in tandem with other countries. One small data point is when you look at the year 2030, they estimate that the middle class in Asia will have a market value of about $36 trillion. And the middle class in the Americas, North America, and in Europe will have a market value of about 18 trillion. So if fundamentally we want to grow our economy, it's going to require us to be in a position where we can sell goods and services to the Asian middle class. But in order to do that, we've got to do a lot of work in America. We've got to create a competitiveness agenda that makes our companies and our industries and our people the best in the world in order to compete with the likes of China and compete with the likes of Europe in selling our goods to those markets in the future. So I do think that whatever happens in the next election, you're going to need to be in a place where we're actually making investments in the United States in order to put us in a position to be more competitive going forward.
Let me ask a follow-up question that's a little bit wonky, but we have a wonky audience here, so I think we can do this. But let me also say I'm going to pass it to Stephanie after this, and then after she asks you a final question or two, we're going to invite the audience to ask questions. We've got a few questions already, but if you want to submit a question, please do so through the site that you linked into. So my follow-up question is about kind of more process and how you organize the government to deal with these domestic and international issues. You were both in the NEC, the National Economic Council, and the NSC. Those are different bodies that have different mandates. They've sometimes been merged through your job, your final job, where there's sort of co-reporting. But frankly, they're kind of siloed. They're different worlds and slightly different. You may disagree with that, but that was my impression working there a couple of times. Should that change? Is that out of date in the sense that these issues are all interwoven? Is there some argument for a more sort of radical structural change in the way domestic and international policy making are done, so there's more cross roughing and more cross fertilization of ideas and processes, or is that just tilting at windmills?
I don't think it's tilting at windmills, but I think it's harder than we think simply because the reality is the White House helps to set direction. But as you know, most of the implementation of policy takes place at the agencies. And that is where you've really got to think differently about what the work looks like, in my opinion. A great example of this is on climate. Climate is one of those issues that is both domestic and international. We cannot solve the climate challenge without working closely with our adversaries and our allies going forward. It is an issue that matters to the NEC and the NSC and to every other part of government. So I do think that there is a need for us to think through, can we organize the government better and differently in order to attack some of these global challenges that where we need to, for example, do a lot of work domestically, but also in order to succeed domestically, we've got to work with our international partners. I think that does start with the way you organize the White House, but fundamentally it also calls on us to think about how we organize the agencies and the way they do their work differently as well. And I think there's a lot that can be done there by getting some of these agencies to do more cross-collaboration, which has been difficult for more than 200 years, but I think given the time we live in is critically important. As we're seeing with the pandemic and we're seeing with globalization, the economy and pandemics don't respect borders. And we've got to work harder to make sure that our government doesn't create borders within it that stop us from being able to work effectively.
That's really my point. It's not about box moving and all of that. That it's not wonky in the sense that my point is this is all interwoven. And so, but I take your point about the difficulty of doing all that, and there may be other ways to get to that better set of approaches. So, Stephanie.
Well, I know we want to leave some time for audience questions, but while I wanted to ask you a more personal question, actually link some of our discussion on the domestic policy agenda, you mentioned in response to the question on inequality, systemic racism and needing to level the playing field. I want to tie that into your own personal experience. So you and Matt and I are all veterans of the Treasury Department. I know in speaking to both of you over the years, we all have great respect for the institution, for the quality of professionals there. I think we also know that, like so many other institutions in the US, there is a challenge of diversity. You were one of the few professionals of color in the senior ranks at the Treasury Department. I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to your own experience there and then say what more needs to be done in order to attract and mentor quality, diverse candidates coming into Treasury and other institutions in the country.
Yeah, and I think I appreciate the question because I do think it's an important issue that we need to grapple with, especially if people like us who are working on issues like economics care deeply about inequality. Part of the role that we can play is making sure that we bring more diverse voices to the table, because it does matter who's sitting in the room, who's helping to design policy. In order to do that well, I think that we've got to focus on two things. One is trying to find more people to enter the Treasury and enter economic policy who come from non-traditional backgrounds. So oftentimes people who enter the Treasury Department have went to certain schools, went to certain programs, and that is their entry point to getting there. For example, SICE is a big place where a number of people who were my colleagues at Treasury had gone to. In order to find more diversity, we're going to have to look into more non-traditional people coming into the Treasury Department and coming into economic policy. And that's going to mean that at places like SICE and in other places which are institutional training grounds for these individuals, you're going to need to take more interns who look different, who come from different backgrounds. And something we don't talk about often that I think is going to be important, especially when you're trying to address inequality, is ensuring that we pay our interns. Ultimately, if you don't pay your interns, the people who are going to have the ability to do internships, regardless of the color of their skin, are going to be people who come from more well-off backgrounds, and that will impact the diversity of the people who show up. The last thing I'll mention is mentorship. And I know that I benefited from the mentorship of senior people at the Treasury Department and economic policy. And what that looked like was them giving me stretch opportunities. They made me the chief of staff at the CFPB when I was 29 years old. That meant that people like Tim Geithner and Neil Wolin, Elizabeth Warren had to invest differently in me than they would have if they'd met somebody who was 55 years old, the chief of staff there. The same thing was true when I became Deputy National Security Advisor. That meant that Jeff Zients and Susan Rice and the president had to think through how they invested in me differently, but they knew that by doing that, they were giving me an opportunity to grow my career. So I think that we've got to do three things within the ranks of economic policy in DC and around the country to create a more diverse pipeline of not only African-American people, but also people of color who enter economic policy. And that's thinking about how we do internships differently. Two is looking for non-traditional career paths. And then finally is investing in mentorship for young people who are interested in economic policy.
Yeah, I feel it's a positive thing. These conversations are taking place all over the country, and those conversations are a first step to actually taking action. But so many of the conversations that I've been a part of really do start with exactly the point you're making, the pipeline. This is not something that you kind of introduce and implement a policy and the problem is fixed. This is years and years and generations, frankly, of work.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that was just such a really powerful answer and touches on a lot of the things that we're grappling with. Stephanie and I both went to SAIS, by the way, so we both smirked when you said that because we really recognize that it just can't be SAIS people getting all the good jobs. Or that SAIS people have to be different. You know, there has to be a pipeline of people coming through places like that are different. Let me just say as an announcement right here, we are recruiting interns for the fall in the CSIS economics program. We are really eager to have a richer, broader pipeline of applicants than just SAIS grads, although we love SAIS grads too. But and so please do look for our job announcement. We're going to be pushing it around much more broadly than we traditionally do. So it's a really important point because, as you know, the interns are the where it all starts. We all had internships, and they were really valuable for our future career development.
Yeah. And when I think about it, I probably wouldn't be sitting here if Doug Elmendorf at the Hamilton Project hadn't given me a shot when I came from a non-traditional background to be his research assistant early on in my career. And that got me exposed to a number of people that we both know that led me to ending up at the Treasury Department. So let me put in another plug for going and applying for the SAIS internship program, because getting a chance to spend time with Matt and Stephanie will definitely enhance your careers.
Well, thanks for that. That was not pre set up there. All right, let us turn to the questions here. We've got a few coming in. There are a couple of good macro and wonky IMF ones that Stephanie can do. But let me start. The first one is about China, that it's been effortlessly able to raise capital in international capital markets, partly because their corporate borrowers have been seen to be essentially sovereign credits, which is a real benefit for them. The questioner says, what can the U.S. do to make this less obviously beneficial to China? But I'd invite you to comment more broadly on China in our capital markets and in their own, for that matter, if you'd like to.
Yeah, and let me broaden this out and just address the question of unfair competition, because I think this is what the question is actually getting to. And I think that it is true that because of the way that China's economy is structured, they have an advantage in some ways vis-a-vis market-determined economies where the government doesn't intervene as greatly in the private sector. And this is one of those issues that we need to address through the WTO or in our relationship with China. And this is one of those costs where we do need to find ways to increase the cost for China for not complying with some of the things that they've agreed to as part of the WTO. I frankly think that China's participation in our capital markets is actually a good thing, because fundamentally it gives us more leverage over China. The more engaged they are in the global economy, the more tied they are to global institutions, the more likely they are to follow global rules ultimately when it is in their economic interest. So while we need to take steps to ensure that we raise the cost of non-compliance with global rules and norms, we do have a huge benefit in China playing into the system that we helped to create.
Excellent. I was just smirking at the new question, so I get to ask that one, the one that just came in, Stephanie. But just go ahead and
Sure. Let me add. This is also, as Matt foreshadowed, a good wonky question. So the question here, you mentioned, Wally, IMF resources, having $1 trillion on hand, the potential need for more, depending on how things go with the pandemic and what the global recovery looks like. This question asks about your take on an SDR allocation. And for those that don't know, the SDR is special drawing rights, kind of currency that can be created by the members of the IMF. And there's been a debate about whether or not the IMF should be issuing more SDRs, more currency, as a way of dealing with the the pandemic. Do you have a view on whether the IMF should be issuing more currency as a way to supporting the global economy?
My view is that the IMF should be looking at ways to improve and enhance its toolkit as we're going to be dealing with a pandemic for several years. Increasing the use of SDR is definitely one of those options that I think the IMF should study. But the reality is that the global financial crisis created a great deal of innovation within the world of finance. And when you look at where we are today, that innovation has meant that financial markets have done far better at this point than the real economy, because there has been a safety net out there, both created by the Fed, but also because we know that the IMF and the World Bank, to a degree, are better resourced at this point than they were coming into the global financial crisis. The longer this goes, the more I believe the IMF and the other international financial institutions are going to be asked to take steps that they haven't taken previously. And that's going to require them to think through doing things like an SDR allocation, which probably matter less for countries in the G20 and potentially could matter a great deal for developing economies and economies that are in need of swaps down the line. So I do think it's something that the IMF should study. But there are risks and rewards to any approach. But at the moment, I don't have a view as to whether this is the right time for them to do an allocation of SDR. But I do think that if things were to deteriorate further and we were to see a need for additional resources, but they couldn't find them through the traditional means, an SDR allocation could be a creative way for the IMF to meet needs.
Great. I've got a good question here, which came in just as we were talking, which is, what path should a 2020 liberal arts college graduate carve out if she or he intends to become Treasury Secretary in 20 years' time? My answer to that question is just look at what Tim Geithner did. But if I can just ask you to, however you answer that, to maybe sneak in a little bit about the Obama Foundation's work on leadership and getting people, young people particularly, into positions where they might be Treasury Secretary someday, if you're willing.
Yeah, and I'll even start there. So my day job is I get to be the president of the Obama Foundation. And President Obama, when he left office, the place where he wanted to focus was not on a particular set of policy issues, but he actually wanted to focus on what could be done to engage young people in becoming leaders, not only in this country, but in the world, focused on creating change in their communities. And the way he puts it is that in his time from being a community organizer in Chicago to being president of the United States, what he found was that it wasn't that we didn't know the solutions to problems. His best example is like, people don't die of hunger because we don't know how to grow food. The challenge, of course, is that we don't have necessarily the political will to solve these challenges due to a number of things that stand in the way. So we're invested in the idea that we want to help young leaders by accelerating their careers and helping them to create change in their communities. So for a young liberal arts student who 20 years from now wants to be Treasury Secretary, what I'd recommend is that you go out there into your community and you figure out ways that you can provide service. And you get engaged in one of these internships. Apply to the SI's internship. Come and learn the tools of the trade and apply those tools to the communities and the issues that you care deeply about. And fundamentally doing that and creating change in your local communities and the institutions you care about often leads to good things. And I think that is a good way of describing what I would say is the career of Tim Geithner, who started at the Treasury as a young civil servant and over time ended up being Secretary of the Treasury. But there's so many stories like that of young people who had an interest in a topic and used that interest to serve the people they cared about, who went off to being able to do great things in their cities, their states, and in their countries. And if you focus on doing what you find interesting and using that to benefit the people you care about, I'm sure you'll be successful.
Well, Tim was in the next office to mine in that early job at Treasury, and whatever he did right, and I ended up here. But talking to you, which is the delay. So I must have done something right. So seriously, we'll take maybe one more, Stephanie, and then although that was such a good one to end on, but go ahead, let's take one more if you're willing.
Yeah, I'm biased toward the one more because it's the same question I wanted to ask as well. And Wally, you'd mentioned that because so much of the response has really been to support financial markets, that companies and countries have been able to issue debt to support them, at least through the pandemic. The question came in, what do you see as the consequences of huge US budget deficits, so US borrowing, but also other countries borrowing, just this big explosion in debt issuance that we're seeing as a response to the crisis? What do you see as the consequences of that, and how do you work your way out of that?
I think it's a great question, and I'd answer it with something that then Secretary Geithner used to say during the crisis. Policymaking is about alternatives, and the alternative to borrowing and fiscal stimulus is worse economic outcomes and probably worse deficits. So I think that the reality is that policymakers are taking the right approach in terms of providing fiscal stimulus and really putting a great deal of foam on the runway for a recession that is going to be deeper and last longer than anyone probably expected at the beginning. But Stephanie, you're right that at the end of this, we're going to have to figure out how we best pay for this going forward. And that's not going to only be a US challenge, it's going to be a global challenge. My sense is that the US will continue to be a place where people will want to lend money as long as they feel as if we have an economic strategy that leads to the US continuing to grow its economy. So the key for us is less in the moment planning for how we reduce our debt and deficit, but rather ensuring that our economic strategy is based on the three criteria that I laid out. One, that it's reducing inequality in our country. Two, it's increasing competitiveness. And three, it's best preparing the US economy for the future. Fundamentally, when investors make decisions about what debt they're going to buy, it's going to be based on what countries they think are going to be most successful in the future. So if we're making the right investments now during this crisis, that puts us in the best position to grow in the future. I have no doubt that we'll be in a position where we're able to attract the resources to both meet our long-term debt and deficit responsibilities, but also meet our responsibilities to our children who are coming up after us, to ensure that going forward, they have the opportunity to do better than we did, which is an opportunity that we don't want to decrease in this country. So I feel relatively good as long as we make the right policy choices now about our ability to deal with debts and deficits in the future.
Well said, and that is actually an even better note to end on. This has been terrific, Wally. You've left us a lot of breadcrumbs of things we want to follow up on in future conversations. The good news is you are a senior advisor to our program, and we can get you back at some point. We hope you'll agree to do that. But this was really terrific. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this program. Really
and good luck with your work, and please give our regards to President Obama.
Will do.
Thanks so much, Wally. In a moment, we're going to do the bottom line, our usual wrap-up segment. But let me just first of all tell you about our next episode, which is on August 6th. Maya McGinnis, who's president of the the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, will be on with us August 6th, 2 p.m., I believe, East Coast time. Wally, I think, used to be on a committee with Maya, knows her well. She's terrific, and we really look forward to that conversation. We'll get into more of the debt questions, no doubt there. So please join us there. With that, I'm going to sign off for now, unless I forgot to say anything else. Please stay tuned for the bottom line. Thanks so much for joining us. And now on to the bottom line. This is our regular segment to highlight other work we're doing in the CSIS economics program and to some of our talent, both in-house and our external advisors. This week, we've got Pearl Risberg, our program coordinator and research assistant, who is going to do a segment on inequality and COVID-19. So now on to the bottom line. Thanks again for joining us.
Well before anyone had ever heard of COVID-19, income inequality in the United States had been increasing over the past 40 years. While the lowest earners' wages have barely increased over this period, wages for the highest earners have increased dramatically. So while everyone on average is making more money, incomes in lower and middle income households are not growing as quickly as higher income households, making the gap between the lowest and the highest wage earners even wider. In 1980, average income of the top 5% of earners was just over 3 times greater than the average income of all Americans. In 2018, the top 5% was earning closer to 5 times the average. This trend becomes even more pronounced the higher one goes up the earnings scale. The top 1% of earners made 8 times the national average in 2018. Looking ahead, analysts fear COVID-19 may widen economic inequality further. This stems from the fact that many of the sectors most impacted by COVID-19, like hospitality and retail, also employ many low-wage workers with limited savings and mobility. What's more, COVID-19 is accelerating structural trends in the economy that were already underway, for instance, to greater automation and more digital commerce. While these developments can boost efficiency and enhance productivity, positive for overall economic growth over the medium term, they also take a disproportionate toll on lower-skilled and lower-income workers. Based on research conducted by the Opportunity Insights Economic Tracker, earnings among low-income workers decreased by 36%, and employment rates among low-income workers decreased by 38% from January to May of this year. To date, government responses to the pandemic have helped lessen the economic impact. But with the benefits about to expire and the end of the pandemic still many months, if not years away, continued support will be necessary to shield the most vulnerable from economic fallout. For more from CSIS Economics on COVID-19, visit csis.org/economics.